If you think about it, the human body is actually pretty freaking awesome. Because we do a lot to our body. We put it through the ringer every day. I mean, you go out, you wake up, and you feel awesome. But then you throw some coffee in it, you go to work, you go to the gym, and while you're at the gym, you beat the crap out of your body, all in the hopes of losing a couple pounds. So let's talk about why the gym makes you tired. Let's talk about some things that happen specifically when you're working out. Your body is like its own personal engine. And like any engine, you have to take in something and burn it to produce energy. And like an engine, that production of energy produces heat. And we will do a whole lab on that whole process of taking in food and how it turns into energy. But today we're going to focus on this heat aspect. And this process puts out a lot of energy, puts out a lot of heat. Even when you are sleeping, you're putting out 250 BTUs, which stands for British thermal units. It's the amount of energy it takes to heat up a certain amount of water. So that's a lot of energy. But your body doesn't exactly burst into flames, or the water in your blood doesn't boil, because you have the ability to cool yourself. And the way that you cool yourself is that you sweat. So why do you sweat? Well, you sweat to get rid of that extra heat that comes from taking your food and turning it into energy, allowing you to do work and move. And it's all about a big process called homeostasis, or staying at the same temperature. So you sweat to stay at 98.7 degrees, or pretty close to. So when you sweat, you release water and electrolytes. And the chemist in me just wants to tell you all about electrolytes and how awesome they are. In general, electrolytes are simply metals. They're things that conduct electricity found in water. So for example, when Gatorade says it has electrolytes, what they're really saying is it has some metal ions in it, like sodium or magnesium. And these are things your body needs in order to undergo normal muscle contractions. So while electrolytes are needed in order for you to perform normal muscle contractions, they actually make up a very small amount of your actual body mass. And most of what you're sweating is just water, because most of you is water. About 70% of your body mass is, and then you have 30% that's other stuff. So really, water is kind of the big thing that you need in order to keep being you. Or at least keep being you that's not drowning in a puddle of your own filth and dying. Because water plays a really big part in being alive. So let's look a little bit more at water. Before we do, we need to know a little general principle called diffusion. All systems move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Think of it like people. If I took your whole class and told you all had to sit at one table, you would all be very squished and uncomfortable. The minute I walk out of that room, you will all diffuse away from that table and take up spaces elsewhere. So diffusion applies to anything. Everything diffuses. It goes from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Whether you're talking about something as big as people or as small as a single atom of a fart, they all disperse from an area of a very high concentration, the table near your rump, to an area of low concentration, around the classroom, away from your rump. When you're talking about water, the diffusion of water is called osmosis. And water always does the same thing everything else does. It goes from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now the concentration of water is referred to as osmotic pressure or tonicity. So it's the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane, like cells, the cells that make up your body. And it's really just situations. And there are three types of situations: hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic. So hyper means lot. So you have a lot of other stuff outside of the cell. And the water, so you have lots of stuff outside the cell and a little bit on the inside, which means your concentration of water inside the cell is greater than your concentration of water outside, and water wants to get out of there. It wants to disperse and go to an area where there's less water. And so it leaves. And if you take a cell and put it in a hypertonic solution, that cell shrinks because the water flows out of it. So in a hypertonic solution, you have lots of water in the cell with some stuff that normally is in a cell. And outside the cell, you have very small amount of water and a lot of that other stuff. And so the stuff out here, the blue sodiums, are overcrowded. They don't want to be near each other. They're going to flow across the membrane. They're going to diffuse if they can. But if they can't, we know that water wants to get out, and water is free to flow across that membrane. So water will diffuse until they're nice and equal-ish. And so the cell will shrink. If you ever put salt on a snail, this is what you're doing to that snail. You are a bad person, kind of. Ooh. The opposite of that is a hypotonic solution. And this is when you don't have a lot of stuff outside the cell, and water wants in. Whew, don't you hate when your PowerPoints are wrong? So if you put a cell in a solution that is hypotonic, and there's a greater concentration of water outside the cell, that water is going to flow into the cell. And what actually happens is usually the cell bursts. So here we have a greater concentration of water outside the cell than inside. And the water will flow in until it gets nice and even. If you have an equal concentration on both sides of the cell, or on both sides, then the solution is said to be isotonic. An isotonic solution happens when both sides of the cell, inside and outside, are equal in concentration. So really quick overview. An isotonic solution, everything inside and outside is equal, and water flows in at the same rate it flows out. In a hypotonic solution, there's more water, there's a greater concentration of water outside the cell than inside, and water flows into the cell. And if this happens too much, the cell can burst. In a hypertonic solution, there's less water outside the cell, and the cell is going to release water, or water will flow out of the cell, and the cell will shrivel up and shrink. So the next time you go to the gym, thank your body for being such an awesome balancing act of water, electrolytes, and heat.